So I'm going to address, I was asked to leave room for questions, so I will try to do that. I'm going to address three related questions. The first is, can we create more Silicon Valleys? And if so, how? And there's just going to be some remarks on this. The attempt is to stimulate conversation. The second is Silicon Valley entrepreneurship working? And are there any key problems that need solving? And the third, relevant of course to this conference, is there government policy that is particularly intelligent for either getting out of the way or helping? So why these three questions? The first is entrepreneurship is how we adapt to the future. It's the key thing. All institutions are to some degree entrepreneurial, created at some point. And why we tend to focus on business institutions as the kind of thing that we do on an entrepreneurial basis. Actually, the same thing is true for governments, NGOs, government agencies, NGOs, et cetera, that there is a pattern of entrepreneurial focus about how do you create new institutions, new organizations, particularly ones that are sustainable, deliver a product or service, and that sort of thing. And I think part of the key that we all understand about the modern world is that the future is we're accelerating into the future. You have the trend of the world being flat. You have technological acceleration of change. You have the flatness of the world becoming globally competitive. And you have a number of things that mean that keeping your pace of adaptation high is very important both as a society, hence the kind of focus on entrepreneurship, and, of course, the related word that is frequently discussed in business circumstances is innovation, because it's how do we adapt, in our organization with our products and services in business, or, organization into the changes that are happening in the future. The second is that Silicon Valley, I think, is still the global capital of entrepreneurship. I think there are a lot of very interesting patterns of entrepreneurship going across the world. India and China are obvious. The kind of state-directed capitalism over the last 20 years in Singapore is very interesting. But in terms of creating a place where a massive number of new products and services coming out that have a global focus out of one very small area is still noteworthy and is still going. And the third is that entrepreneurs are, to some degree, modern explorers, the modern pioneers. We don't have the kind of, go west and discover the gold mines anymore. We have the, invent a new technology or service. And the key question is, how do we as a society and with the government relate to this? So let's get to the questions. Can we create more Silicon Valleys? I think the basic answer is yes, but I actually think it's an entrepreneurial question. And the reason why it's an entrepreneurial question is there's not a way to do it with 100% certainty. Matter of fact, like most, I think trying to create an entrepreneurial ecosystem, which I generally think you should focus on a city basis when you're thinking about it, I actually think that what you're doing is you're doing a startup, and it may work or may fail. One of the general rules in Silicon Valley is about 1 out of every 10 startups succeeds, roughly, right? So when I say not 100%, I'm not thinking 80, right? I'm thinking something sub 50. And, but the other part of it being an entrepreneurial effort is it has to be a unique effort. And part of being a unique effort is that when you're an entrepreneur and you're starting a business and you say, well, I've got a, kind of a phone, like a new phone that's exactly like this Nokia phone, and mine's going to be a new startup, and I'm with this new phone. Well, what's unique about it? If you have nothing unique, you die. The same thing is true about creating an entrepreneurial ecosystem. So one of the paradoxes that I get involved in a lot in Silicon Valley over the last 2 or 3 years is government officials coming by Silicon Valley saying, how do I create Silicon Valley where I sit? And part of my advice to them is don't try to create Silicon Valley, right? Try to create a unique entrepreneurial ecosystem where you have a competitive advantage. Because one of the really key things about entrepreneurial ecosystems is they're essentially attract entrepreneurs. The metaphor that I use for entrepreneurship is you throw yourself off a cliff and you assemble an airplane on the way down, right? So the impending mortality of doing that, right? Entrepreneurs are willing to move, right? So, like, if I'm going to be more successful there than here, I'm going to, a lot of entrepreneurs will go, okay, but I'm going to move there for this kind of business. And so when you're thinking about how do you construct them, you try to construct one that attracts, like one of the tests for are you creating a good entrepreneurial ecosystem is will it attract your kind of entrepreneurs, your kind of talent, your kind of finance, and create the right kind, almost like a competitive organism, the right one here. So someone, for example, Singapore coming through town saying, hey, I want to create exactly Silicon Valley software entrepreneurship in Singapore. It's like, well, maybe there's a local focus that'll work. But generally speaking, try to attract something else where people go, oh, for that, I wouldn't want to move to Silicon Valley, I'd want to move to Singapore, right? Or for that, I would want to move to New York rather than Silicon Valley, or for that, I'd want to move to Shanghai. Now, Shanghai actually is probably not the right example, because one of my beliefs is actually there's 3 internets, English speaking, Chinese speaking, and then everything else. And I don't think actually, one of the hypotheses that I'm still testing is whether or not one can be successful in both Chinese and English. Thus far, I think the answer is no. And so, so I think the question is, you can create these kinds of entrepreneurial centers, but there's a couple of key things about them that I think are important to understand, and we'll get to, will be the right kind of presage for thinking about how should government policy work. So one of them, as I mentioned, is immigration is central to entrepreneurship. And I don't just even mean immigration like, how much of Indian technology entrepreneurship has been responsible for creating massive companies in Silicon Valley. I also even mean, like, for example, Mark Zuckerberg in Boston goes, well, really, in order to make Facebook work, I'm just going to move to Silicon Valley and rent a house there with some of my friends and make it go, because that's the place to do consumer internet things. And so when you think about it, and the other thing that people tend to also think in terms of immigration is like, well, just getting the founders in. No, you want the whole stack, right? It's not just founders and executives, but also engineers and also product managers and the whole thing all the way down. I want to participate in this industry. And a parallel is, for example, Hollywood. Hollywood doesn't just attract, the A-list celebrities. It also attracts photographers and, and grips and the whole thing. There's a whole industry around it where the ecosystem becomes competitive that way. And that's one of the things I think is really central. And obviously, my guess is we all agree with each other in this room that an intelligent, driven, attractive immigration policy is really key to creating the right kind of economic ecosystems. And it's something I'm happy to talk about at more length. The second is that open networks are really key to entrepreneurship as well. So there is this classic belief that what makes Silicon Valley special is you take a bunch of tech talent, you take some tech universities, you take some tech companies, and you take some venture capital, and you throw them all in the soup and you kind of stir. And oh, look, right, there is a entrepreneurial ecosystem. Now, one of the things that kind of tells a lie to this implicit view is, it sounded like my phone, is that there's a really great book written by Annalise Saxenian on the question of venture capital was invented in Boston. Boston had all of these same attributes, all of these same ingredients, right? That is kind of the generic thought of recipe for how do you create an entrepreneurial ecosystem. And yet Silicon Valley over the last 3-4 decades has accelerated so fast as to be by far and away a much larger entrepreneurial ecosystem than Boston. And why is that? And part of it is that the pattern of how people work together and how labor works is essentially something I call open networks, which is you don't just kind of sit within your own company and only talk to people in your own company. People have lunch with each other across companies. They actually trade information inside about, like, for example, not confidential information to companies, hopefully, most of the time not, but things like, well, what are you using for development pattern? Have you heard about this new tool, Hadoop or Cassandra? Are you using it? What do you think the future of it is? What's the pattern by which you're running your software development? What are changes going on in the industry that you should track? Is there new ways of getting customers that, we can talk about in a generic way and help each other? Those sorts of things. That's a use of open networks. And one of the things that Silicon Valley does very well is it create both the right culture and kind of legal framework around open networks. And so, for example, one of the things that Annalise Saxenian pointed out is California as an ecosystem is massively benefited by having much lighter anti-compete contracts for individuals, e.g. the freedom of labor, than, for example, Massachusetts, right? And that kind of ability to have those things work is really important for creating the right kind of entrepreneurial ecosystem. And the third is, it's not just the capital. One of the things that capital does with entrepreneurs is they essentially, when it's done well, you partner with the entrepreneurs. And as such, you need to kind of know what you're doing in the game. So like, for example, people who just say, well, I'm going to hold out a shingle and now going to become a financing person for these kind of entrepreneurial ecosystems, that generally doesn't work that well. You usually have to know the game pretty well. And all of those things, I think, are really key to making, to being potentially successful for creating essentially entrepreneurial ecosystems like Silicon Valley. So is the Silicon Valley entrepreneurship pattern working? Classic problem that you hear griping from a lot of people is there's too much capital. And indeed, it's a challenge, right? But it's kind of the same challenge you get in any kind of business competition, right? So when you have a very desirable thing, a lot of entrants try to compete. That's a classic thing that in economic theory competes margins down, right? And one of the reasons why you try to, and I think there'll be a panel on this tomorrow, there's thoughts around, how do you constrain monopolies? I'm not saying anything is monopoly or not. I'm just saying it's an important topic. and so the same thing happens is true in terms of too much capital. Now, that being said, part of what I think the gameplay, there will continue to be a lot of investment, which I think is a good thing, because investment that's essentially how do we adapt to the future and how do we create the right products and services that both help us as consumers and help our economy is the exact right thing to happen. And the fact that there's a bunch of capital going to that is, I think, a good thing from an overall social point of view. I think it makes it more challenging when you're one of the people competing. But you can still win, because the funds that basically get one or more of the blockbuster deals in them create really, really good returns for their LPs. And as long as that continues, that cycle continues. So, however, the immigration thing that I mentioned before is something I think is a serious interest. And one of the paradoxes that I've come, when I was thinking through the immigration stuff, I realized that one of the paradoxes in the entrepreneurship ecosystem, which is so important to us as a society, is like, well, we don't have like an entrepreneurship lobby, right? Because entrepreneurs are off doing it, right? And so how do you get the right focus on allowing the room for the new and the creation from a public policy point of view, and what are the institutions we should create in order to do that, which is one of the reasons why I agreed to participate in this conversation. But so like immigration is, I think, one of the really key things, and I think the question of how do you get the right talent in at all of the different levels. I'll talk a little bit about that when I get to some of the specific things that I think are interesting. And then, the third is, what can governments do? Now, classically, the thought is governments, basically, the reason why governments generally kind of have a bad clash here is because, like, for example, like here was when I was thinking about the notes for provoking this talk, it was like, could you imagine creating a bureau of entrepreneurship? It'd be like, oh God, right? Because the ecosystem has to work as a network, right? And as a multi-part distributed system, and having centralized planning, right, as an attempt for doing that is a very bad match, right, from strategy to result. However, I do think that there's a set of things that are clearly pretty important. The right kind of talent pool, right? Once again, waving at the immigration, but also, for example, all of the investment that was done in technical universities and creating technologies, long-term research projects, and all the rest of that stuff was really important, and I think could probably even be done more intelligently and directed, because most of it came, of course, from DoD funding and NSF funding, which was great and did a really good job, but could be done better if it was really targeting economic results, as opposed to, for example, intelligent tanks or whatever the specific thing is. So some of the things that folks in the Valley have written about are on the immigration stuff is doing a startup visa, where you basically say, look, if you have a good startup, pass a security check, you can get a visa. Another one is technology. Like if you get a great technology degree here, we have these great assets that we've invested in for decades, hundreds of years even. With security check, staple a green card or a visa or whatever to the diploma. One of the ones that I actually wrote about is in an op-ed for the Washington Post about a year ago, maybe it was about a year and a half, was a proposed revision of the H-1B system, which is eliminate all the caps, but impose a 10 to 20% payroll tax. And the reason was, what I was trying to do was persuade the government that we really did mean what we were saying, which is it's about the talent, not about the cost. We're not trying to undercut the salaries of local people, which is a reasonable government consideration. So just make it more expensive, right? Use a market economic system as a way to allow as much of that talent to come in and to be recruited as possible. The other thing I also said in that was, and I think I didn't write that this well, was, for example, if you're trying to figure out how to stimulate interest in, for example, industries and other areas, how do you use a financing mechanism or a general network mechanism in order to create the right kinds of responses? And so, for example, I had proposed a potential kind of way of using venture capital for that. What I hadn't made clear was I wasn't talking about software venture capital, which I think has more than enough capital. More, for example, manufacturing or other kinds of industries that we think are key. How do we get the right thing started from the beginning with a kind of a 3 to 10 year time horizon? That's generally entrepreneurial efforts with venture capital, and if you need to incent it because the returns are either more risky or potentially lower, that's fine because we need that as a country, potentially. So, like I said, all of these remarks are aimed at creating a conversation in the room, since I was prompted for leave a lot of room for discussion, questions, and answers. And so I'm not really trying to make the decisive argument by which you would take any particular point and say, oh yeah, that's absolutely right, but rather create something that's in a conversation. So the summary, as a way of kind of looking at this, is when we're trying to create entrepreneurial ecosystems, we have to think of them as a network of these resources. And even when you have all the networks, and even when you put the resources and you put them together, there is still this kind of the creation of life, amino acids all put together, and then lightning strikes or it doesn't, right? And that is one of the risks in doing this. Now, part of what you do when you're doing this as an investor, looking at entrepreneurs that you back, are that you need key people who are driving this, who are empowered to kind of make a run at it. And it'd be one of the things that I think would be a really good kind of, the way that I would think about doing economic revitalization within the US is how do we create more kind of entrepreneurial centers in some of the places that are most challenged, Newark, Detroit, et cetera. And I recognize it's a very high, challenging bar, right? But I think ultimately that's the kind of thing that we're going to need to do in order to get the kind of economic revitalization we want. I don't think it's going to happen through, a centralized planning mechanism. I think it's going to happen through an enabling of the network to do it. I think it'll take multiple tries, just like entrepreneurship. So with that, those are opening remarks, and questions discussion is, I think, the name of the game.
So do we have the microphone? There's no microphone?
Well, it's a small enough room. Speak up. I'll repeat it.
Ed Hurst. My question for you, you talk about central planning and entrepreneurship. The Chinese obviously disagree with that assessment. They've got their indigenous innovation, graduating lots of engineers of whatever quality. They're really putting a lot of money and effort on it. Do you think that's going to be a dismal failure, or do you think they will find a new Chinese way to create it?
Well, it's one of the things so the basic question is the state-driven capitalism of China creating the right kind of entrepreneurial ecosystem by what they're doing? Now, the elements I think they're doing that are obviously very good are trying to create all of the raw infrastructure pieces. That was part of what I was recommending too. So for example, if you either want to create all the technical talent or you want to import it. You need one of the two, right? Maybe both. So that stuff I think works pretty well. I don't think that they are actually putting lots of energy into, okay, we're going to necessarily try to totally pre-program at least the new industries, but a lot of the industries they're going up the curve on are actually somewhat well understood industries already. Like, it's not necessarily, like, for example, I've seen venture firms in China investing in chicken farms, right? And it's kind of surprising from a Silicon Valley point of view, because normally what we do is we try to look for what the configuration of the future is. And you say, well, okay, chicken farms is actually a good investment in China because there's such a massive increase in the demand for chickens going up that you invest in chickens, you actually get a good ROI, right? And so, now that's not the kind of thing, I don't actually look at that as kind of a bureau centralized entrepreneurship, because I don't view that, like, creating chicken farms is a very good thing. That's kind of more of the question of, okay, we're taking models that are largely understood and then we're kind of industrializing the country. That's the way I look at that. Now, the question, when I had asked myself the question you just asked me, and this is like I'm a participant rather than an analyst, right? But it was more Singapore, right? Like Singapore did a really good job of essentially creating a labor force that caused a lot of people to come and use their labor for higher end kind of manufacturing kind of industries and that sort of thing. And they did a very, very good job of massively upping the economy and doing all of that, and it was kind of a state-driven capitalism. But they haven't, in any industry that I've tracked, and maybe there are some, and this, I have a lack of knowledge here, but they haven't done in any industry I've tracked the creation of massive new product. I don't know if that was useful or not.
I think it is. I'm sort of looking a little bit out towards the future. In addition to the chicken farm example, they are putting tremendous amounts of money into research centers and finding, whether it's through direct funding or through protectionism, their hope is to develop future.
Well, so I think creating all the pieces that create the infrastructure, like think of the entrepreneurial ecosystem as a platform, having all the elements of the platform is, I think, a good thing to do, right? That's precisely what I think we should do more of. What it is, though, is saying, okay, we're going to, for example, let's say we're going to be a government and we're going to create the California or the U.S. Venture Fund. That's a little bit more tricky, right? Because it's supposed to creating a platform that's trying to pick the apps, as it were.
Yes, Jonathan Zuck is my name. You mentioned early on that there isn't an organization to sort of promote entrepreneurs or something because they're all out working. And certainly there are organizations like Kaufman or things like that sort of see themselves in that role and that have, in large measure, developed fairly sophisticated analyses of what the best public policies would be, what the best public policy environment would be, the environments for entrepreneurship. I'm almost concerned that the public policy concern for entrepreneurship is fake. That people say they care about small businesses, they say they care about entrepreneurship, but it's really not a priority. I've ceased to think that it's ignorance about what needs to be done, and it's more about political will.
So I like Kaufman and what they're doing. I try to help them when I can.
That's just one example.
Knock something over. I think that one of the questions, I do think that one of the things that happens, and this is the actual paradox that I was reflecting on, is the creation of these entrepreneurial efforts are key to our future, and yet it's much more easy when you're embedded in the political infrastructure to respond to immediate things. So for example, when you think stimulus package, the way this is described is shovel-ready jobs, right? And you're like, okay, well, shovel-ready jobs are interesting. That's not to say it's not uninteresting, but how do we have a very kind of a powerfully constructed ecosystem in 3 to 7 years? And there's a natural the natural progression of, oh, I'm responding to these lobbies, I'm responding to other political interests, and that tends to always drown out the entrepreneurs, because even though there are some folks like Kaufman trying to do it, people are like, okay, I can deal with that later, I don't really care. And that's the thing that it's like I've started talking to Kaufman and trying to think about how do we up the level of that seriousness within the political reality, because it's important to all of us. So I think I agree with your assessment of currently, like it's more lip service than it is reality, and how do you increase the status of reality?
Danny?
Hi, Danny White here. Thanks for the nice speech. I'm curious on this question of what government can do, whether you have a sense of whether there's any real urgency in any of the sort of ideas that you threw out. Because there's no doubt that we see successful things, and kind of as you were saying before, we'd like to promote them. Certainly, government would like to get out ahead of these things and be able to say, oh, we created we created the biotech Silicon Valley in wherever it might be, Indianapolis or whatever it is. But I guess it's a slightly contrarian question, but I wonder whether you think that there are areas in which failure to act now are really going to have dire long-term consequences, whether we're in a mode where we're saying, well, maybe we could realize some extra opportunities. It seems to me that a lot of the decisions government decisions that led to the current Silicon Valley environment are, they're decades-old decisions, right? Yep. If not more. And I just wonder whether from what you see, even anecdotally, are there gaps that you could see 30, 40 years from now that we ought to be doing something like that now?
Well, the basic question is, and I think one of the accurate critiques that's made of us relative to the Chinese is how long-term is our vision, right? And so you say, well, in these long-term investment circumstances, does it kill us if we do it next year rather than this year? Answer, not really. But it is kind of a slow fade away into to less relevance and death, right? And so, one of the challenges is you could try to create a fake kind of like it has to be done this year, or we're and just use that as a political vehicle, right? In order to do that, and you may have to just on terms of political reality in order to make that happen. Now, the truth of the matter is we need to shift towards how are we investing for the future in really intelligent ways, like e.g. not spending but investing. And this is actually one of the paradoxes of how I think even individuals are trained in home ec, which is it's actually not saving that you're trying to do, it's investing. Right now, it happens to be maybe your own personal best investment is to put it in the bank and get a de minimis interest, because other investing you won't be able to do as well. But that kind of investing into new productivity is the key thing in order to maintain competitiveness. And so then you go to the question of urgency, and you say, well, the level to which you need to invest now depends on what your competition looks like. And if your competition is investing, like say nation-state competition, if your competition is investing well for the future, you'd better damn be doing it yourself too, right? And it's the parallel exactly how businesses compete with each other, right? And how kind of country ecosystems can kind of compete. And so, I think that it's right that you could say, well, it may not be now, but I'm kind of like remembering, Martin Luther King's letter from the Birmingham jail, which is, actually now is a really good sense of urgency, right? When you're trying to deal, and his question was a question of justice, right? Not global competitiveness, but when you see the issue, strike.
Yeah, thank you. Nigel Cameron. I'm going to press you on this question of Washington, because it seems to me that the faster technology is going, of course, the curve is going up. Ironically, counterintuitively, the longer term we really need to be thinking before we make decisions, which is the point I think totally lost on most people in DC. Do you think there is anything trending in the policy community in Washington? I mean, it seems to me that is the key question here, whether things are getting better or whether perhaps they're getting worse.
So one of the paradoxes from a Silicon Valley perspective is we mostly avoid Washington, right, and run around it. And I'm one of those people who runs around it generally, although I've kind of come to the view that I should try to help more.
Well, is this not a short-term solution in the Valley?
What I've been trying to think about, though, the reason I set myself the question, I was going to ask, like, how is entrepreneurship going within Silicon Valley? And I set myself the question of, can we create more ecosystems like this? And how do we do that? As a way of trying to break down the problem into something that's potentially manageable. And I have yet to see anything reflected out of Washington that has any kind of like, oh, we're driving on this in a good way. And matter of fact, certain trends, which is one of the reasons I harped on immigration, strike me as going 180 is the wrong direction, like fast. And you're like, no, wrong direction, turn around. Right? And so, part of what I'm trying to do is kind of, how do I contribute to our civic society, is trying to figure out how do I as an individual help move that. And so, for example, I generated this H-1B idea because the idea was to try to dismantle the argument that you just want to undercut American labor and you just want to take the middle class and kind of press their operating margins down. You're like, no, make it more expensive for us. We'll still do it, right? As a way of doing that. I tried it with literally 5 people in administration, and I was like, nothing happened, right? So I haven't seen anything reflected out of it in a way that's using. Now, one other thread here, by the way, that I've been thinking about, and obviously this is one of the things that the Technology Policy Institute does, but trying to figure out better ways of essentially setting business councils to help guide government is actually another thing. Like, we could figure out how to professionalize that, not in a way that's just lobbying. Like, all of us with our companies show up with, we want you to have the policy here because it helps our company. How do you set that to a civic basis and get the network intelligence the right way into the government would be a really good also thing to set up the right way. And again, part of the reason I came. So.
You talk a lot about Lincoln and Verizon, about innovation and entrepreneurs and how they create innovation. Recently there was a study that looked at how we define innovation in the economic sense, and there really isn't much work that's been done to define that. One of the issues that with that study looked at, though, was that a lot of innovation is not technology, it's actually business models, pulling things together in new ways. The reason I raise that is a lot of the policy issues that we see in Washington around technology really focus more on business models in many cases and how they affect the market than they do technology. I don't know if that's your impression or not, but that's what I see.
Well, I actually think of capitalism as a technology, right? So I think it's a very interesting, innovative technology. I think the question about how it's a way of kind of like there's a financing piece of the technology, there's a labor market piece of the technology, there's those kinds of things, and we have certain regulators on those, you know, kind of antitrust and all the rest of the stuff. So I actually think business models and how you pull the business models together in a really interesting way is actually part of what you're doing with innovation and disruption. So, for example, Zynga, which I'm on the board of, look, nice new social games, Facebook enabled that, but part of what's actually deeply innovative is actually how the business model works, right? Which is okay, make these games playable, and then once they're playing them, have components within them where the economic goes. And actually that works very well for the same pattern that made a lot of the internet should be free as a disruptive thing. All of a sudden you can get to a much broader audience and then start monetizing after you've already gotten that distribution. And that kind of pattern is an innovative pattern. So I think, in short, that's a long-winded way of agreeing.
Well,
Just actually tell me yes or no question. You've looked at a lot of applications. Have you ever looked at either an application or a category and said, gee, great, really fantastic, but the network speeds in the United States just aren't sufficient for that to work?
I think there's a number of things that it's a great question. I don't have the examples on the tip of my tongue, but there's a whole set of things. I mean, one of the paradoxes of venture capital is you meet hundreds of things and you say yes 2 or 3 times a year, right? And it's kind of frustrating when you're also an entrepreneur because you'd like to say yes more often. And there's sometimes it's competitors, sometimes it's the teams. There's a whole set of reasons you look at no, and some of them sometimes are, yeah, that's a really interesting app, but the compute cycles, the network cycles, or something that's really not ready yet, right? Like it'll be interesting to see how much of kind of AI techniques come back into a mass market thing based on, okay, we have more compute cycles. Does that work better now? And should we reevaluate the ones that just literally couldn't scale, right? More as a way of doing that. And the same thing is true on the network basis. Now, the only thing that's really coming to mind is various patterns in video, but I'm sure that there's more. And feel free to email me and ask me the question again, and I'll figure out some. Because I just have to re-index all the pitches I've heard. And you say no for different reasons.
So to take you back to your core business, it feels to me like a lot of the platforms have been built, and we get about one a new one a decade. We have Yahoo, we have Google, we have Facebook, we have Twitter. So once a decade, there'll be a demand for VC capital upon the next platform. But it seems adoption is now going to be driven by content, this innovative content, like what Sam's doing with GrooveShark. Those tend to use a lot less capital. So if it is content that now will be the focus for the next decade of adoption of these platforms, is there too much VC money around? Will you have to demand lower returns? And really, what happens to the VC community if the next decade is about businesses that really don't use a lot of capital to break before they break even?
So let's see, 3 parts. So I do think that with a lot of competition, a lot of venture firms, it'll be hard to have discontinuously high returns, and that there will be a limited number of funds that successfully do that. The ways that they successfully do that are successfully investing early in the things that get massive scale. I don't agree that platforms are done, right? Matter of fact, one of the tests that I use for my own investments is it a platform, a network, or a marketplace? And almost everything I invest in can be described as one or more of those at a very broad basis. And that's one of the reasons why I invested reasonably successfully. So I actually still am doing that pattern in terms of how I look at it. And I think those are still rolling out because I don't think it's, part of what I think made the internet so spectacular is this massive open platform that a lot of people could actually innovate within, and then that created a variety of either, you call them sub-platforms or, marketplaces, but things of massive scale within that. And so anyway, that's kind of one thread. And the second thread is capital efficiency. And I think that it's true that you can start software businesses much cheaper these days, and you can actually make more progress with them. I actually think that's ultimately a good thing for the whole ecosystem. It makes it a little harder to be an effective financier, because you have to kind of know how to pick early and everything else. Because once, of course, it's got 10 million users and is growing at 1 million users every month, everybody kind of knows you kind of want to, that's kind of interesting. But I think that's possible to do professionally. And what's more, all of these, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, Zynga, Pandora, all of the ones that are kind of in the current kind of hockey stick arc in the consumer internet side, all have gone through multiple rounds of venture capital. And the VC firms which have invested in them, generally speaking, all of them, because all of them at some stage, because they get so large, actually create discontinuous returns. And so part of how you can measure, just from the outside of looking which firms are going to actually, their LPs are going to go, ooh, I was really glad I was an investor, is more or less, are they in these, have they invested in these things that have done this? Right? And that's what the game really looks like. And that's still very doable. Now, the word content, the last part of your question, the word content tends to be a little loaded. It depends on what exactly you mean by content. I've avoided investing in most things that look like kind of Hollywood or newspaper or that kind of thing content, because I don't actually know what that model looks like on the internet and whether or not it's ready to do that. The only exception I made to that was I invested a small amount of money in Funny or Die, because I thought, well, comedy is kind of viral. Let's see if because I always have this view with, one of my favorite expressions is, in theory, there is no difference between theory and practice. And so I'm always testing my theory. Right? I'm like, well, I don't really believe in content this way, but here, let me try this one and see how it goes. And so, depending on what you mean by content, like I said, almost all of my investments are in platform, network, or marketplace as the model of what I'm doing. And I don't think of that as content. I think of those as kind of very broad, and platform, marketplace, and network are somewhat interchangeable. They have different dynamics, but they have the same kind of foundational structure. So that's a long answer, but anyway.
Any other questions?
You should have told us whether his investment in Funny or Die paid off.
I'm not sure I'm allowed to say. And actually, it's still, frankly, I think it's still TBD.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
There's one question over there. If you.
I don't want to keep the group, but this is perhaps a more philosophical question. Are you concerned about the impact on entrepreneurs of wanting to look to the government at an early stage for money or for regulatory super or for protection against a rule or a rule that helps to raise a rival's cost? Or are you concerned about the distraction from the quality that you identify where they're out?
The only place I've encountered that with anything where that kind of concern crossed my radar was clean tech, and mostly as a, oh my God, this is a lot more capital intensive than we thought. Please give us a whole bunch of free capital. My view is that capital is better invested in creating the kind of the entrepreneurial ecosystem as a platform for everything than in choosing specific apps. Like, I'm not a big believer in, we're going to invest in green, even. Right? It's like, we're going to invest in entrepreneurial ecosystems and technical talent and all that kind of stuff, and then we'll see what comes out of that, right, as a way of doing that. And so that's the only place. Now, part of it is Silicon Valley is so intensely, run in terror from DC, right? That with that one exception, most of the time we just kind of, one of the metaphors I've heard for Silicon Valley, which I thought was kind of funny, is Silicon Valley is like a teenager, which likes the government to be out of its hair until it needs it, right? And so, anyway, so I haven't seen many uses of the government as a attempt to block competition, because the general fear is, one of the things that makes Silicon Valley go is you look around and you see everyone else running at such speed, it causes you to run as well. It's one of the reasons why even in something nominally as global as the consumer internet, which you'd think, hey, there should be giants everywhere, Google, eBay, and Yahoo are all within 25 miles of each other, right? And why is that? Well, part of it is because the whole entrepreneurial ecosystem, and part of that entrepreneurial ecosystem is you see how fast people are running and you just run, right? And so, government cycles, trying to get the government to block your competitor, takes too long, right? So anyway, that's a set of reflections on that, and just from my perspective. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.